created that during the migration of the birds, they would look down and see what appeared to be a beautiful lake for them to rest on as they went on their way. And as soon as they touched down onto the oil lake, they would get caught and they would not be able to escape. There was some conditions where they tried to save the wildlife, like a marine spill in the ocean where it covers the birds. But there was tens of thousands of birds that were caught and killed. In one lake alone, they counted over 20,000 birds that had been caught and killed in that area as well. Here is the Saudi Arabian coastline. Kuwait is up here. What happened is the Iraqi soldiers turned the spigots on, turned the valves on at the loading port, and allowed the oil to just flow into the Persian Gulf unimpeded. And that's why 15 to 20, 22 million barrels of oil was just poured into the Persian Gulf. The water flow is north to south, and it wound up coating the Saudi Arabian coastline for the most part. I don't know if you can see this, but you can see this is the rocky shoreline. This is all oil sludge left over. Mangrove swamps in Saudi Arabia were totally devastated. Wildlife areas, estuaries were totally wiped out during this time. This shows you a little bit of, this is actually water. And so one of the problems is Kuwait does get rain, quite well, we may think. And they depend on, they may get 4 or 5 centimeters of rain a year. But that's very important to the desert farm. What the oil does is it didn't allow this water to infiltrate. So you not only have the chemical contamination by the oil, but you have progressing the water table, the water ecology of the area to be affected as well. This is a road for the most part that should be over here. It just shows there's a lot of wind, there's a lot of sand movement in Kuwait. Now I want to make the point that as of today, there's been no major attempt to clean up the oil pollution, oil lakes in Kuwait. And why is that? That's because of political hassling and political issues. I don't know if you remember, but Kuwait went to the UN to sue the Iraqi government for damages, which included environmental damages. The first damages to be settled were loss of life, of property, and I think the Iraqis were made to pay, I think, about $40 billion in that. The last component of that lawsuit, that legal battle, was the environment. And so it just got awarded 2006. At the end of 2006, the UN awarded a $3 billion settlement to Kuwait for the environmental and public health damages by the war. That was 15 years later. And things don't stop in the environment and wait. And so you have destruction, you have sand covering, some of that tar, some of that pollution, some of it you may never even be able to find again. So that's all I want to just kind of put it in perspective of the Kuwait situation. What I've worked a lot in the U.S. is petroleum contamination, mostly products, not crude oil, as we saw in Kuwait here. But we in the U.S. have been looking at probably since the early 80s at the cleaning up of petroleum contamination in soils, and that's my area. And so I just wanted to give you a brief kind of overview of how we approach that in the U.S. Now, I have to tell you that this is not how the UN approached the cleanup to Kuwait, but I'll get back to that in a minute. So when you're faced with, and this is true with any type of contamination, that you have to make a decision. And in the U.S., we've gone through an evolution of how to approach cleaning up the environment. So the first response is usually you polluted the environment, you have to get rid of all of the pollution. So you have to clean up the contaminant so it's non-detectable. That's an incredibly costly approach to environmental contamination. And a lot of times, when there's one contaminant, there's usually other contaminants. Your contaminant that you're responsible for may have been there before because of other responsible parties. And so yours was just a small portion of that. So if you're a company or you're a government agency, an industry, and you're being made to clean up to zero, that may be enough to put you out of business. We've had cleanup sites in the U.S. The military, for example, in the U.S. had estimated that it was going to cost $50 billion to clean up all of the contamination at military installations just in the U.S. alone. The petroleum industry had estimated that it was going to cost over $10 billion to clean up their facilities, their refineries, and facilities in the U.S. When you try to clean up to zero, it sounds good, but it's not feasible. Economically, it's not feasible, and quite frankly, being a responsible environmental citizen, it's not even reasonable to expect that. But that's where it started, and you get activist groups, and you have a lot of well-meaning people trying to get the environment cleaned up to a zero contaminant level. That went on for a while. There was a lot of scientific debate processes to try it as an alternative to cleaning up to zero level. The other problem with zero level contamination cleanup is you can never measure down to that low. It's usually what you find is in the U.S. you would set a contamination cleanup level of a certain amount. That was basically what was the smallest amount you could detect given the technology. So if you're a company or a municipality, a city, and you have a contamination issue and you want to address it, and you want to know, well, how much will I have to clean up? And you base that cleanup and your economics on a certain level, and then it's that level because that's the best you can detect using technology, and then a year later, a different flame detector comes out for your analysis, and you can get down an order of magnitude lower, then the regulatory agency will force you to go down to that, and all of a sudden your economics are out the window, and your plans and anything just become irrelevant. And it becomes very difficult to forecast and to try to pay for cleanup based on that sort of approach. The second one is background. That seems like it made a little more sense. Then you don't have to clean it up to get rid of it all. All you have to do is clean it up to where it was before you released some sort of contaminant. That sounds reasonable as well, except when you try to decide what's background level. You have industry on one side saying background was this high, it was higher. You have the federal agency or the state agency saying no, it was a lot lower. And then you don't even, because the contamination has occurred, you don't know what it was before the contamination. And again, it becomes difficult to set a standard based on background. And you then have a lot of debates, discussions, arguments, and I think you guys have lawyers here in Azerbaijan. I'd be willing to bet you don't have as many lawyers as we have in the U.S., and you should count your blessings for that. Because when lawyers get involved, prices go up, costs go up, things take a long time. The UN resolution to the Kuwaiti oil rights probably took as long for the environmental component because of lawyers and lawsuits and arguments and counter-arguments. So cleaning up the background, although it may sound rational, that when you try to put it into practice, it becomes difficult. Things go contamination is left, arguments, lawsuits occur. So the third way to approach, and the most reasonable way to approach cleaning up contamination, is from a safe level. What is safe? What's the risk involved? And we call this risk assessment in the U.S. It's part of what I refer to as risk analysis. And risk analysis in making environmental decisions, cleanups, is basically you do a risk assessment to determine what the risk is to either the public, and that's human health risk assessment, or to the environment, and that's an ecological risk assessment. The second step is risk management. And risk management is you're trying to alleviate the risk. So that's cleanup. That's remediation technology. And then the third R in risk analysis is risk communication. Because one of the issues is that the public has to understand what you're doing and what the basis for that and the scientific strength of that. For example, if the government has a cleanup level that allows a certain amount of a contaminant, the public wants to know why. Why should you be able to leave that amount of a contaminant behind if it's bad for you? Well, the issue is that, and these are the three components of risk analysis, is that there's always risk in everything. Everything we do in life. We're being exposed, there's benzene, toluene, and xylene, BTEX, in crude oil and products. But there's also benzene in eggs. And there's chemicals in pretty much a lot of things we do in life. If you smoke, there's benzene that you're being exposed to. So to say you have to get rid of all of that is, as I said, unreasonable. And there's a certain amount that you can leave behind that will be of risk, give you some risk, but not very much. And the overall scheme of your life, it's minimal. And so you should be allowed to leave some behind because it won't have a major impact on your health or the environment. So the risk assessment process is basically a procedure that's been developed, and I'm not going to go into the details of it, that allows you to go through and determine what the risk is to humans and to the environment in any particular environmental situation, contamination situation. And risk is defined as a hazard and the amount of exposure you have to that hazard. So risk can be high if you're not exposed very much, but it's a very hazardous material. And you can also have a high risk if it's not very hazardous, but you have a lot of exposure to it. So in the process of managing that risk, as I said, that's remediation. It also may be keeping people away from the contaminated area, that you don't have to clean it up at all or clean it up to a lower level if you keep people away from it. For example, in the Kuwaiti situation, if you have petroleum contamination in the residential area where people live, that is more serious than even some of the oil leaks in the oil field, because there are very few people that go out into the oil field. The oil fields will always be oil fields. There'll never be, schools. There'll never be hospitals. There'll never be houses built on the oil fields. And so you should allow a higher level of contamination because the exposure is going to be less from a population standpoint. Risk communication is important, as I said, because you have to make the public comfortable that what you're doing is proper, it's scientifically sound, and it's in the best interest of the public. Now, the public sometimes sees its best interest as I said, cleaning up to zero. But if cleaning up to zero drives a company out of business, an oil company out of business, for example, there are no more jobs, there's no more oil, there's no more resources, then you may have a clean environment, but you won't have an economy. You won't have jobs. And those things have to be weighed into a decision when you clean up. I think we've seen in the U.S., as I said, a movement from overreacting, cleaning up to zero, to seeing that there are other impacts beyond just health risks that are important. The economy, jobs are more important in some cases than leaving a little bit of a contaminant behind. There are two types of risk assessments. One is human health, and one is ecological risk assessment. They're obvious. There are different approaches that you use in determining these. The human health risk assessment is probably the most prominent. When you're looking at a risk assessment, you're trying to, there are four components of it. You're trying to find out what's the hazard. You have a contaminant. What does that mean? How hazardous is that to humans? And so you do tests. You may actually even do tests on animals and then extrapolate to the human condition. You may use models to look at what the dose response is. First, when you identify what is hazardous and what is not, then is how much is hazardous and what does a larger quantity of the substance, how do people respond to it versus a low dose? If it's, you have to know the dose response to be able to do a rational approach, how much to leave behind. The exposure assessment is how many people, when people are exposed, how much are they exposed to? The gentleman indicated I've done some work on soil ingestion in children. The reason why we've done that is because in a lot of contamination issues, the driving force is the contaminant is bound to soil. It doesn't evaporate, so you don't breathe it. It doesn't get into the groundwater, so you don't drink it. The only way it can get into the body is if you ingest soil or if you inhale dust fumes. And it turns out that children are the most susceptible in most cases, environmental cases. They're the most fragile, most susceptible part of the population. And it turns out children eat soil, either willingly, when they will just take handfuls of soil and put it in their mouth, or if they drop their lollipop on the ground, or their hands are sticky and they put their fingers in their mouth. And so we have made a career out of looking at how much soil children ingest, because that will drive the risk assessment, which drives cleanup numbers. We got involved in a project, a chemical project in the United States, where the proposed cleanup level was equal to the proposed cleanup level meant that the company was going to have to spend as much money as the net worth of the company. And so, I'm not an economist, but I know what was going to happen if you forced that. There was going to be no more company. And so the company went to the federal regulators and said, you base those cleanup numbers on a risk assessment that has an exposure element of how much soil children eat that is outrageously high. It was about a pile of soil this high on the desk and this wide every day. That's what the estimate was. And so we were contracted and got a grant to do an actual soil ingestion study on children. And I'll spare you the details of that because it's before lunch and it gets a little it's not the kind of conversation you have before lunch. Help yourself, or you can use modeling. That risk characterization is in taking all of this information and deciding what is the risk of leaving that contaminant there, at what level. So for example, it's X amount of contaminant in this soil, then you can